Hello and welcome to the webinar. My name is Leslie Anderson and I head up the Propane Gas Association of New England. And I'm going to be speaking to you today about the Jones Act and how it affects propane supply and our customers here in New England and throughout the US. This is the region that the Propane Gas Association of New England is made up of. We have 6 states: Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. Combined, our propane gallonage is the largest of any state in the country. And we are a growing residential market here in New England. We have also the highest combined energy prices in the US. Electricity is more expensive here than it is in any other part of the country. And that's partially because we're better at closing and prohibiting energy infrastructure than we are at building new pipelines or new ways to bring energy into the area. In the propane market, we're very rural for the majority of our market, and we are a growing residential market. We're also extremely seasonal. We have huge peak demand during our winter months. And unlike other regions in the US, we have no production sites within New England, and we don't have any pipeline access directly in our 6 states. Highlighting one of the great ironies of the Jones Act's repercussions are the marine terminals in New England import our propane literally at times from the other side of the globe. Even though the US is currently the largest exporter of propane globally, coming from much closer sources on the East Coast or on the Gulf Coast of our own nation, we can't have these ships stop here in New England on their way to another country because of the Jones Act. When you look at the logistics within our area itself, about 90% of our propane in New England comes from rail terminals. Rail comes into the area from Canada, primarily in the northern 3 states. And in the southern 3 states, most of it comes in from the south or from the west into our region. And we also truck quite a bit from Selkirk, New York, where the closest pipeline is outside of our region, but pretty close to it, adjacent. We have 2 marine terminals in the area, one in Newington, New Hampshire, and one in Providence, Rhode Island. In the past, when we've had big demand and we've had trouble because ships have been delayed or other supply concerns with rail lines being down or on strike or other things, we've raided other areas throughout the country. And the cause of our supply problems usually cascades across the industry and causes problems in other states as well. Surrounding states have assets that we go after for propane. We'll go get propane at salt caverns in New York. We'll go to Pennsylvania for product, and we'll go as far away as getting assets from other places such as Colorado and Georgia for some of the most extreme examples that I can think of in past times. So when we have problems in New England, it affects the rest of propane supply across the country. The biggest problem we have is the Jones Act. In 1920, the Merchant Marine Act was passed. It's over 100 years old, and it's better known as the Jones Act. The law was presented as a plan to ensure that there was adequate domestic shipbuilding capability and a ready supply of merchant mariners to be available in times of war or other national emergencies. The law's aims are to achieve those objectives by restricting domestic shipping services to vessels that are US built, US owned, US flagged, and US staffed. But a century of evidence has supported the conclusion that the Jones Act has really failed in its main objectives while imposing substantial economic costs. These costs impact our entire energy sector, including the propane industry and including our customers. Within the propane industry, the Northeast suffers disproportionately from the Jones Act because of the geographical slide that I just showed you and our restrictions that we have in terms of how we get and keep our product. In this webinar, I'm going to try to explain the reasons behind the Jones Act and how it impacts our industry, and how we have really led the efforts with the National Propane Gas Association to lobby for energy waivers under the Jones Act, if not an outright repeal of this archaic, burdensome law. Why hasn't the Jones Act been repealed? There are a small number of beneficiaries, which primarily include domestic shipyards and some labor unions, that are more powerfully motivated to preserve the status quo than the far more numerous adversely affected interests that are seeking its repeal. Supporters claim that the costs are justified by the benefits associated with the Jones Act, which include, most importantly, the preservation of a robust, competitive domestic shipbuilding industry to undergird U.S. national security. But over the years, the U.S. shipbuilding capacity has atrophied. The active fleet has aged, and the number of merchant mariners has dwindled. The Jones Act supporters have been successful at cloaking their scheme in national security arguments. Proponents lean on a national security rationale that is entirely without merit, and Jones Act opponents, even those advocating limited reforms, are portrayed as blind to these national security interests. So this is another case where evidence is there that's enough for the policymakers to tune out arguments based on logic and on fact. After 100 years, the incumbent interests, the regulators, and the politicians have gotten used to the privileges of a system that benefits a concentrated few. In addition to untangling these political alliances, the repeal efforts will have to contend with pushback from agencies and committees with oversight authority, and those authorities have created institutional interest. Jurisdictional turf for the Jones Act includes 16 congressional committees and 6 federal agencies that have some form of oversight authority. So this is what we're up against, and this is the reason the Jones Act is still around. If you go back to when it was enacted, the Jones Act was signed into law on June 5th, 1920, less than 2 years after the end of World War I. The wartime deployment of hundreds of thousands of American troops to Europe, as well as the vast quantities of material and equipment, had placed enormous demands on the country's sea lift capacity and required the support of foreign flagged vessels. That dependence on the foreigners was seized upon by some of the people in Washington as evidence of a glaring weakness in the U.S. national security and a reason to beef up the country's shipping fleet and our shipbuilding capacity. Senator Wesley Jones, the Republican from Washington, was serving as chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, and he introduced a bill to encourage greater commercial use of the U.S. ships. Among the provisions in the Jones legislation were requirements that ships eligible to transport goods from one U.S. port to another have to be U.S. flagged. So going from one U.S. port to another, you have to be a U.S. flagged ship. You have to be built, owned, and crewed by U.S. citizens. These provisions require that the ships be at least 75% U.S. owned, 75% U.S. crewed, and assembled entirely in the United States, with all major components of the hull and the superstructure fabricated domestically. Although Jones presented the legislation as a national security imperative, various remarks made by the senator at the time betray protectionist and even nationalist motives. In particular, he said that before the war, we had to depend on foreign ships for our business. We had to go to our competitors to get our goods to market. I want ships to fly the American flag on the Pacific. There is nobody nowadays to look after American interests except we Americans ourselves. It is said this bill will drive foreign shipping from our ports. Granted, I want to do it. The Jones Act restricts non-qualifying vessels from operating in inland waterways and from transporting cargo between 2 U.S. ports. This activity is known as cabotage. Most governments around the world have some form of cabotage restrictions. The U.S. is among 11 countries that fully exclude foreign vessels without exemption. And according to the World Economic Forum, the Jones Act provides the world's most restrictive example of a global cabotage law. In the U.S., where foreign competition in cabotage services is restricted, only 2% of the U.S. freight travels by sea. Compare this with the European Union, where cabotage among member states is permitted, and the corresponding figure is 40%. And then if you look in 1994 at New Zealand, they relaxed their cabotage restrictions and experienced a decrease of 20 to 25% in coastal freight rates over the next 6 years. So it's interesting as you look at the requirements and the costs that we have and how this all affects. So the irony of the Jones Act is that the first casualty was actually the US shipping industry itself. The primary objective of this law, remember, was to ensure a vibrant shipping industry as a pillar of US national security. But over half the Jones Act vessels that operate today are barges on the Mississippi River. In fact, 9 out of 10 commercial vessels produced in the US shipyards since 2010 have been barges or tugboats. Among the ocean-going ships of at least 1,000 gross tons that transport cargo and meet Jones Act requirements, their numbers have declined from 193 to 99 just since 2000, and there's less than 78 of these that can even be deemed militarily useful. One of the main causes of that decline is the onerous domestic build requirements of the Jones Act, which prohibits US shippers from operating vessels constructed abroad. American-built coastal and feeder ships cost about $190 to $250 million, whereas the cost of a similar vessel in a foreign shipyard is $30 million. Accordingly, the US shippers buy fewer ships, the US shipyards build fewer ships, and the merchant mariners have fewer employment opportunities to serve as crew on these non-existent ships. Meanwhile, we're facing exorbitant replacement costs, and ship owners are compelled to squeeze as much life as possible out of their existing vessels. That means that the Jones Act fleet is not only shrinking, but it's rapidly aging. The typical economic useful life of a ship is about 20 years, but 3 out of every 4 US container ships are more than 20 years old, and 65% of them are more than 30 years old. If you take away the tankers, the ships in the Jones Act fleet currently average 30 years old, fully 11 years older than the average age of the ship in a world merchant fleet of other developed countries. These increasingly decrepit vessels are not only inefficient, but they're also dangerous. Here's a picture of the first US bulk LPG vessel, which was the Natalie O. Warren, a dry cargo ship retrofitted with pressure tanks. The ship went into service for Warren Petroleum in the late 1940s, and it shipped propane from Houston up to Newark, New Jersey. Warren Petroleum eventually became part of Gulf Oil, and the ship was decommissioned after in the 80s, I believe. But today, there are no Jones Act propane ships that are available for us for commercial service. So we don't have the ships even existing to use. US shipbuilders' output has been less than 1% of China and Korea's shipbuilders. Not only have we atrophied into global obscurity, but the builders that do operate have become extremely reliant on defense purchases. Although the shipyards of Europe no longer churn out large cargo ships as they once did, competition in Europe has instead forced them to find unique areas within their industry in which to specialize. European countries are still dominant in a few specialized markets, such as cruise vessels, where they have 99% of the market share, 43% of the offshore vessel market share, and 65% of the luxury yacht market share. In general, these segments are characterized by high degrees of specialization and high-tech qualities, complex production processes, and they're building a smaller number of vessels, but more specialty vessels. And this is a specialty niche place in the market that Europe has evolved and moved their shipbuilding to. In the US, we have no competitive forces. The US shipbuilding industry has not felt compelled to evolve and similarly find its own competitive niche. Instead, it produces numerous types of vessels for which it possesses no particular advantages compared to foreign sources, and we produce them at a much higher cost. Given the dilapidated condition of the Jones Act fleet, it should come as no surprise that it plays a minor role in supporting overseas military operations. However, this whole act is meant to foster a domestic maritime industry and avoid the need of relying on foreign shipping during times of war. But the Jones Act has done the exact opposite. The US forces that were deployed to Saudi Arabia during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm had a much larger share of their equipment and supplies carried by foreign flag vessels than they did US commercial flag vessels. Only one US flagship was actually Jones Act compliant, and they couldn't find enough sailors that were merchant marines to sail them and had to bring back into service 2 80-year-olds and one 92-year-old sailor to get the ships there. At the time, the Vice Admiral Paul Butcher, who was then Deputy Commander of the U.S. Transportation Command, remarked that without the availability of foreign flag sea lift, it would have taken us 3 more months to complete the sea lift ourselves. Another component of national security is the capacity to respond quickly and effectively to natural and man-made disasters. In this area, the Jones Act again falls short. Rather than serving as an asset in such scenarios, the law actually functions as an impediment by disqualifying ships from providing relief. Theoretically, this problem could be mitigated through presidential waivers of the Jones Act. But believe it or not, the protected industries tend to lobby in opposition to any waivers, including those extended for humanitarian purposes. The director under President George Bush for his National Economic Council reported that following Hurricane Katrina in 2005, shippers, shipbuilders, and others lobbied hard not to have a Jones Act waiver. And Trump was pressured into a mere 10-day waiver, which was not enough time for all of the ships to go to Puerto Rico after the hurricane that beleaguered the island there. The most obvious and direct effect of the Jones Act on waterborne transportation is the increased shipping costs. By limiting participation in the U.S. maritime and inland waterway transportation sector to U.S.-built, U.S.-owned, U.S.-flagged, U.S. crude ships, the cost of moving cargo by water is artificially inflated, and the resulting harms are simply a matter of supply and demand. A Maritime Administration report found that the operating costs of U.S. flagged vessels engaged in foreign commerce in 2010 were 2.7 times greater than those of their foreign competitors. The daily operating costs, insurance, repair, and overhead for foreign flag vessels came in at about $7,500 compared to $20,000 for U.S. flag vessels. And a lot of this is crew costs compared to foreign flag vessels. So it's no surprise that the labor unions are among the Jones Act's most vigorous supporters. Maintenance and repair costs are also inflated by a provision in the Tariff Act of 1922, which was also supported by Senator Jones, that mandates that repairs made in foreign ports be subject to a 50% ad valorem tax. These high costs, in combination with the foreign flag competition, considerably inflate waterborne shipping rates, which is nothing less than a massive tax on the economy otherwise blessed with tens of thousands of miles of coastland and inland waterways. Here in New England, we have the biggest resource is our waterway that we really have, and our coastline. But we only have 2 marine terminals in our area because of the Jones Act. Businesses have alternatives to waterborne transportation, and the amount that we're spending because of the Jones Act has caused other transport ways to move materials to be more cost-effective and more attractive. So the Jones Act has reduced the supply of ships and drove up the cost of waterborne shipping, and it's increased the demand for road transport by driving up prices of trucking and of rail as their demand has increased. Another impact of the Jones Act is the environmental impact. Changing the Jones Act offers the prospect of substantially reducing our environmental costs created by freight transport. Here in New England, transportation is our biggest polluter, and it's the biggest source of greenhouse gas. And one of the reasons for that is because of the Jones Act and the fact that we move so much by truck and rail instead of by ship. Using more marine transport would reduce the emissions from freight transport, especially for greenhouse gases. Criteria air pollutant emissions from water transport are slightly higher than for rail, but lower than for trucks. Both intensive and extensive changes to the prevailing regime could yield external environmental cost reductions of as much as $8 billion a year. But by forcing more carbon-intensive surface transportation methods into use, the Jones Act is responsible for creating unnecessary Environmental costs. The world's most carbon efficient form of transporting goods, far more efficient than road or air transport, is marine transport. And the amount of carbon dioxide that could be reduced if we were using more marine and less truck would be substantial, especially here in New England. But it's not only environmental considerations such as that. In 2015, trucks, by far the most used mode of moving freight in the United States, carried 11.5 billion tons of goods compared to over 1 billion tons for the Jones Act vessels. If even a small percentage of this cargo was shifted from trucks to coastline shipping, it could have significant economic and environmental benefits. More than 500,000 qualifying international containers moved over highway and rail in 2012 were allowed to stay on water and transport ships and move up the intercoastal and other ways. The economic benefit could be over $200 million. Most of our states are connected by waterways and marine highways. Indeed, our highways mimic our marine coastline here in New England. Nearly 40% of the US population lives in a coastal county, and coastal shipping of cargo between US ports in the lower 48 states comprises a negligible 2% of domestic freight. As if to make even more compelling the environmental case for ending the Jones Act, according to the Congressional Research Service, some of the most congested truck routes are Interstate 95 in the east and Interstate 5 in the west. They run parallel to the shipping routes that are there. If you add up all the costs for truck transportation because we don't have more use of our ports along their sea coast, and you add these up, every year it costs our families in America over $2,000 a year in additional costs. Provisions of the Jones Act also hinder the development of alternative energy sources. Here's an offshore wind firm, the Deepwater Wind, that became aware of a law when a specialized wind turbine installation vessel it needed for installing wind turbines was prevented from touching the Rhode Island shore because it was built in Europe and it wasn't a Jones Act vessel. So they couldn't use the vessel that they needed to put the new wind turbines that they put in off the coast of Rhode Island, even though there wasn't a US flag vessel that made these. So instead they had to make do with various barges and other ships instead of the specialized vessel, which cost more and delayed the project and is probably going to increase the cost of these types of alternative energy. The profound effect of the Jones Act on the US shipping not only raises transportation costs for businesses throughout the US economy, but it also reduces revenues in many cases as well, squeezing profit margins from both directions. Rate differences between Jones Act carriers and foreign carriers make foreign sourcing more attractive, even when the foreign option is hundreds of miles away. For similar reasons, Hawaii cattlemen have been forced to fly their cows to market in California rather than ship them. And airlines in Puerto Rico typically import jet fuel from foreign countries rather than bringing it from the nearby Gulf Coast. This practical attribute to the difficulty of finding available Jones Act vessels to transport fuel in the first place and the cost of doing so when the vessels are found has created a lot more of a demand outside of the US when we could be using US sourced products. The Jones Act also has sourcing decisions for other commodities such as rock salt. Maryland and Virginia obtain the product for wintertime use from distant Chile instead of domestically, despite the US being the world's largest producer of that commodity. Very similar to what we do here in the Northeast. During the height of the Russian scandal in the politics, this article ran in the Boston Globe and in the Washington Post. In peak time in the winter, in order to get more natural gas to provide electricity up here in New England, we have to bring it in by ship. And they brought it in from Russia in the winter rather than bringing it right up the coast because we don't have the capacity in the Jones Act. So instead we got it from Russia, which at the time we were involved in a political scandal with. So the infrastructure costs, the amount that's generated when trucks and freight trains are used as substitutes for waterborne shipping also provides a lot of wear and tear on our highways, our bridges, and our rail lines. And this is an argument that policymakers have been listening to when we've been lobbying them. According to the Congressional Budget Office, in 2014, $165 billion was spent on highways, $92 billion went to capital spending, and $73 billion to operations and maintenance. And even though our trucks are only 10% of the traffic on our roads year-round, they're responsible for 75% of the total road maintenance costs. And we're pushing our railroads and our roadways to the limit. We've had a doubling in New England of our rail shipments, and the rail has increased as less propane is moved by pipeline and more shipped to terminals for export as well. Over 20,000 rail cars are now in service at any time, and 50 to 60% of this fleet is usually full, creating mobile storage inventory for our industry. Our marketers in New England have worked diligently since 2013 to increase the number of rail terminals, and storage inventories have increased throughout the country with the additional rail infrastructure, storage terminals, and bulk plants. However, rail is rail, and we are reliant on the railroads to get our product moved in a timely manner during our periods of peak usage. Other ways that you can move propane are also interesting, but first let me pause for a historical propane fact. So the father and man that discovered propane here in America, Dr. Walter Snelling, before he got into the propane industry, he actually worked, I believe for the Navy Department, and he perfected an underwater detonator that was used in the construction of the Panama Canal. So fast forward to June 27th, 2016, the second day of the grand opening of the new expanded Panama Canal. And the first commercial vessel that went through the expanded canal was a liquefied petroleum gas tanker owned by a Japanese shipping company. It was one of the first ones that had applied for passage, and it came from Houston, Texas, en route to Japan, and was the first commercial ship through the Panama Canal. So propane is being exported from the US all over the world. It's cleaning up the world as one of the clean fuels that's being used to replace coal, and as a portable fuel that provides healthy indoor cooking. So we've got great demand, so much so that it's the first one through the expanded Panama Canal. However, we can't get product into New England unless we go to great expense. Transportation's been relatively successful in reducing air pollutants, but greenhouse gases are a different story. And in the transportation sector, they've increased 20% since 1990. And over this time, the transport share of the total US greenhouse gas emissions increased under 24% to just over 27%. Relative to the overall transportation sector, marine transport is relatively clean, and reallocating freight across modes has potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But to do this, we really need to make some policy changes and make it more attractive for us to use waterborne transportation. Part of cleaning up the waterborne transportation has come from propane-powered vessels, and we have LPG now powering ships in order to meet stricter air standard requirements on the marine side. So if we could bring cleaner ships that are even powered by propane into the industry, it would help to reduce the environmental impacts that we're seeing now because of the Jones Act. In New England, we've been pressuring NPGA to make sure that the Jones Act has legislative priority and that it's been an issue brief at the last 3 Propane Days. One of the things that's really important, I think, throughout the industry is that we not be reliant on hours of service waivers. But in New England, until we get a change in the Jones Act and can bring more of our product in by rail during peak periods of time, we are going to always have a need for hours of service because of the seasonality of our product and other concerns that tend to pop up from problems with supply rail outages, blocks, strikes, that sort of thing. Issue brief talks about a bridge that washed out in Canada. And then this last season, we had 2 strikes that affected rail coming into our area as well. And without marine terminals, we would be in a bad place here in New England because we wouldn't have the supply that we need if we can't get it from other locations. That's not to say that there's not other locations out there, because we do get it from pipeline and from rail from other sources that are there. But at times when you're looking at that peak period of winter supply, if we could bring it in and have more of it available from vessels, it would be better for the industry. The problem is that it's more expensive to bring in by vessel than it is by those other ways, even though logistically from a transport standpoint, it doesn't make any sense. In 2019, we teamed up with the Rocky Mountain Propane Gas Association to have one of the first ever joint visits with associations and senators at Propane Days in Washington, D.C., which is put on by the National Propane Gas Association, who has been very helpful in helping us to lobby and try to move forward legislation related to the Jones Act. The Senator Mike Lee of Utah had introduced a bill that would exempt propane shipments from the Jones Act under a provision that would allow a waiver in cases where ships do not exist or where they're not available. And this is a picture of us meeting with the group, the PGANE on one side and the Rocky Mountain group on the other. So what we're hoping that we can do is get a waiver similar to this one that was written as the most recent bill that's introduced by Mike Lee of Utah, to have it included in a provision in an upcoming infrastructure bill. So I want to thank you for your time today, and I'd like to recognize the work that the Cato Institute has done on the Jones Act, which has been a source of most of my research that you've seen in this presentation. I'd encourage you to join our fight by supporting our organization. The Propane Gas Association of New England is at pgane.org. You can download a membership application from that site. If you want to stay up to date on what's happening with the Jones Act in the news, then follow PGANE on Twitter. I retweet many of the Jones Act related articles on this social media source. And I want to just conclude today with a short video from the Cato Institute, which nicely summarizes the issue. And I hope that everyone will join us as we try to find a solution that would be better for our citizens and for our industry by getting a waiver for energy under the propane and propane under the Jones Act, or for repealing the Jones Act. So thank you for your time.
The Jones Act is a 1920 law justified on national security grounds as a means to bolster the U.S. maritime industry. It restricts domestic shipping to vessels that are U.S. built, U.S. owned, U.S. flagged, and U.S. crewed. However, this law boosts costs by banning foreigners from competing and forcing Americans to purchase ships that are up to 8 times more expensive than those built in other countries. The result is higher transportation costs. Shipping oil from Texas to the Northeast, for example, costs 3 times more than importing oil from Africa. Ultimately, consumers foot the bill. In addition, higher shipping costs push freight from ships onto other sources of transportation, such as trucks, which means more traffic and pollution. Meanwhile, this blatant protectionism has failed to benefit builders of ships in the U.S., whose production is less than 1% of those in China and South Korea. Domestic builders have seen over 300 shipyards close since the early 1980s. Jones Act defenders claim the law ensures adequate U.S. ships during times of war, but during U.S. deployments during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, foreign flagged commercial ships carried twice as much equipment as their U.S. counterparts. In fact, the U.S. was so desperate for shipping that it twice requested the use of a cargo ship from Moscow. Both requests were denied. So the Jones Act has failed to achieve its shipbuilding and national security goals while driving up costs for consumers. It's time for this outdated, costly, and ineffective law to be repealed. It's time to end the Jones Act.